Hello, my name is Desmond Lynch. I am 25 years old and I am a filmmaker. I recently made an audio drama miniseries and I would like to tell you about it. How I made Death to Dorkau. Death to Dorkau is a story about a group of men who decide to overthrow an evil despot but ultimately fail. It's a political espionage tragedy that takes place in this dark fantasy world of Terra More, which is the very same world in which both the Witch in the Orchard and the Witch Chronicles series takes place in. The series follows a man called Dorkane Milos, who is a priest in the Church of Dorkau. Dorkau is this god emperor of this wasteland city-state called the Terrianas Resolve, where the story takes place. Dorkau claims to be a god, and the people of the city, who are these mutant people from the waste, worship him as a god. However, Dorkau isn't actually a god, he's just a very powerful wizard capable of controlling dead matter, thus achieving his own immortality. Dorkau rules with an iron fist. He is locked in an eternal war with another immortal called Nekli Sun. They are both fighting over the resources found in a mountain called Tekayun. They both command armies of the dead. However, Nekli Sun's army is more like ghosts or revenants, while Dorkau's army are more like zombies. So whenever they fight, Nekli Sun's forces essentially respawn, while Dorkau's forces are ultimately destroyed. Therefore, he needs a constant resupply of fresh meat, which is why he has coerced his own subjects into sacrificing themselves. They believe they are ascending to glory, but in actual fact they are killed by zombies, and their corpses thereby turn into zombies, thus creating a supply chain for Dorkau's army. This has gone on for 1,000 years, becoming a great tradition. However, during one sacrificial period, the army of the dead accidentally attacked the convoy of soldiers leading the Chosen to the Deadlands. One of these soldiers is the son of Major Tyrannus, a prominent military leader in the city. His son dies of his injuries. In his grief, Tyrannus is radicalized to overthrow Dorkau and the current government. He enlists a group of like-minded military leaders and public officials, including Dorkane Milos, who he has an antagonistic relationship with because Milos is responsible for his son's death. Milos is going through a crisis of faith, and he is pressured by an official, Lieutenant Alagar, into joining the conspiracy. Later, Milos is forced to become the assassin. The conspiracy ultimately fails due to internal bickering, incompetence, corruption, and betrayal. In the end, most of the conspirators are killed, with a few escaping into hiding while Milos is captured and tortured. Milos later takes his own life through magical means, an act of defiance against Dorkau and the government of the Resolve. That is the story of Death to Dorkau. Now I will talk about each part of production from development to post-production. Let's begin. Development. A while ago I wrote an audio short drama called Dinner with Dorkau. It introduced Dorkau with Monarch Matrichny, the so-called leader of the Resolve. In it, they discuss a failed assassination of Dorkau and the history of the Resolve and the Waste itself. Like most Witch Chronicles episodes, the short would serve as a means of world building while introducing us to characters that would appear in later stories. I kept thinking about telling a story within the Waste. For most of the Witch saga, we've heard from people in Kasia, the part of the world that is not a magic nuclear wasteland. So I thought about the assassination attempt of Dorkau. I thought it would make an interesting story. I decided to write it up before I made Dinner with Dorkau. At first, all I had was a title, Death to Dorkau. It's catchy and gets straight to the point. The title would become almost like a mantra in the story, as it's used to create solidarity amongst the conspirators. I knew what I wanted was this series to be like Operation Valkyrie meets dark fantasy, but instead of Nazi military officials attempting to assassinate Hitler, we would see these mutants of the Terrianas Resolve try to kill the God Emperor that rules them with an iron fist. But of course, they would ultimately fail. The main thing I wanted to communicate with this story is what these regimes are ultimately like. Throughout the story, you see constant examples of mismanagement, corruption, negligence, nepotism, and ego-driven leadership that ultimately diminishes the power and effectiveness of the government. In fantasy, you typically see villains as this really brutal, efficient, evil regime. With this show, I wanted to make it a bit more realistic. All the smart people have either been killed or have fled, leaving morons and sycophants in charge. And through their greed and lust for power, they've essentially created this cycle of mass death. It's a really bleak depiction of what dictatorships and tyrannical regimes are actually like. This story takes place in a fantasy world. There's a lot of lore and thus a lot of exposition, which is why I always try to make sure there's an emotional current underneath to keep people engaged. That emotional current is Milos, who is deeply flawed but very relatable. He's in a state of grief and guilt, spiraling into this crisis of faith. He's easily coerced into doing something that causes him more harm than good. I wanted Milos as the protagonist because I felt a priest becoming the assassin was incredibly original. The internal and external conflict he exhibits is incredibly dramatic. I also wanted a person amongst these cold-blooded military people that would stick out like a sore thumb and people would latch on to. He's the guy who doesn't belong there, which is what makes his perspective on this whole thing very interesting. The conspirators themselves, I wanted to make interesting as well. You have Major Tyrannus, who's this cold, calculating military guy who's just in a death spiral of grief after the loss of his son. You have Aligar, who is just this cold-hearted bastard who is completely out for himself. Prince Rylok, who is a young, idealistic hothead that wants to usurp his father to save the kingdom. The only sane one amongst them is General Varanus, who in the first episode calls the plan stupid and just immediately bails. With the series being short, 3 episodes averaging 30 minutes each, I knew you had to be picky about who gets screen time. There's 10 conspirators total, but you only really hear from 4 of them. It's easier to write, less messy to edit. The audience won't get confused by 10 different voices, they only have to remember 4 people. Writing is very different depending on the medium in which you are telling the story. With books, you want a lot of prose, rich descriptions, stuff like that. With film, you want an emphasis on blocking and visuals, less prose. With audio dramas, it's kind of like half of both. The good thing about these dark fantasy stories I write is the characters get to be very poetic. I'm not trying to achieve a more naturalistic way of talking, which I aim for in my film projects. However, it being an audio-only medium, you have a lot more restrictions. You want to try to write simply with no reliance on big, heavy visuals or complicated set pieces. You want to keep in mind the audience. You want to ensure that at all times they know what is happening. Whether that be writing in a narrator that describes what is happening or writing in a sound that describes what is happening, keep it simple. It's easier to imagine, it's easier to edit, it's easier to understand. With this project, I went more the line of having the tale be told subjectively. With Orchard, we had this omniscient narrator that saw and described everything from their surroundings to what people look like, what they're doing, etc. With this story, I wanted to go with more of a Witch Chronicles vibe in which the narrator was the protagonist. The narration was minimal as well, with the setting being so chaotic, it being set in a magical nuclear wasteland with all these characters being mutated humans. The narration could have gotten overly complicated very quickly. This isn't a novel and it's more of a radio play, so I wanted to keep it snappy. The big thing about Orchard was, while I do believe it's very good, it can be a bit daunting going into it because you don't know anything about the world, which is why for this series I selected to have an opening narration by a character called The Beholder, as I felt they would be able to give a brief introduction to the world and a vibe to new listeners, so that they are not overwhelmed or confused by what happens in the series. The dialogue can at times become quite clunky, it's very exposition heavy, but that's unavoidable because you're literally talking about a fantasy world that no one has ever heard of before, so you have to explain how things work. In the context of the story, however, I try to make sure that nothing is ever addressed that doesn't need to be addressed. Meaning, if it's not relevant to the plot, if it doesn't reflect what the characters are feeling or what they're doing, you don't include it. So stuff like the history between the Waste and the Kazian Empire that's never really addressed. You never get a big detailed monologue explaining the beef between Necklace Soon and Dorkau and who they are or how magic works. Basically, unless it sounds right for the characters to talk about those kind of topics in the moment, then those topics aren't addressed. The goal was to portray this world from the perspective of this small in-group of people who knew they were being oppressed and thus wanted to be liberated. I very much wanted that 1984 vibe where the world is cold, cruel, and unfair, and hope just seems like a lost cause. Despite that, I kind of Well, I tried to give it a happy ending, albeit bittersweet. In 1984, there is an inclusion from a history book in the ending explaining the terminology used in the time period of the oppression. The existence of such a document implies that at some point the regime is overthrown and they get a free society. I wanted that kind of sliver of optimism in the end of the show, where just by listening to the story, by knowing who Milos was, there is hope that someday the regime will fall. A lot of people have critiqued my work as being overly dark and depressing, and it is. There's no denying it. I've yet to be able to write a happy ending, probably because I don't believe in it, but with this one I tried, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not it's good. I think I made 2 drafts of the script before I began production. Each draft you try to make more concise, efficient, better, more dramatic, and engaging. I knew I wanted Milos to have a complicated relationship with Tyrannus, him being responsible for his son's death and then going on to being a vital part of his conspiracy where they had to spend quite a lot of time together. I thought that was fascinating and had the potential to be very dramatic whenever the tension between them started to rise. In regards to episode layout, I wanted episode 1 to be a slow burn intro, introducing the players, what they wanted, what was likely to happen. Episode 2, of course, was the episode where the assassination took place, alongside a bunch of other exciting things. Episode 3 is where we deal with the fallout of the failed assassination and coup. This is always where it would have ended up. In regards to structure, I had Milos' scene in the prison cell with him being dragged off as his introduction in episode 1. For one, it makes him very interesting. The audience is compelled and now sympathizing with the character. He's a nice guy, albeit a very passive character. This introduction also serves to show that the conspiracy is doomed to fail and that this story is a tragedy. So you have that looming dread overhead at all times. With writing, you have to understand people demand more from fiction than reality, because reality is messy and doesn't make sense. People don't like reality. They like order, structure, clear-cut rules. So when writing fiction, if you have a world of rules, you have to follow them. Otherwise, the audience will reject it. So when in the first draft, we had the Masor blade, the weapon chosen to kill Dorkau be a fake weapon with no magic power at all, it didn't sit right with me after the first draft because, well, it kind of felt like you're making stuff up. So I added a scene in the first episode where it's revealed Milos had bought a very fancy weapon that turns out to be a cheap knockoff. At first it may come off as an irrelevant scene, but it helps solidify the fact that this world is deeply corrupt and fraudulent, and because of this scene it makes perfect sense that the assassination is foiled by a dodgy weapon, because that is a general fact of the world. It's already established and therefore it doesn't feel like you're just making stuff up. When writing characters, you want to give them all a distinct voice. Especially a lot of military people, you need to be able to clarify who is who. Aligar is the sleazebag who plays the devil's advocate. Tyrannus is the dogmatic leader. Rylock is the cocky hothead. They all have distinct personalities, and because of that, when they talk to each other, it's going to be more interesting than if they were all the same. You also want things to happen to make the story more interesting. Generally, you try to avoid stuff just happening for no reason. An example, you don't want to write stuff like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, because it feels very railroaded and formulaic. You want to try to write like, this happened, therefore this happened, but because this happened, this therefore happened. It's all tightly weaved together and with cause and effect. When you're trying to represent what it's like to live in a tyrannical regime, you also have to portray what the revolutionaries are like as well. They're not small farm boys going off to take on the empire. These guys are hardened military leaders sick of the regime and they think they can do a better job. Dorkau and the government are objectively evil, but the revolutionaries in the story are by no ways good people. And that's shown by how they talk to each other and what they do. In the end, I kind of wanted a story like Operation Valkyrie in a fantasy world, but like a way more incompetent version of that story. Because these guys would have won if they just bought from a more reliable source for weapons. These guys would have never gotten a chance at killing Dorkau if the regime wasn't so overconfident and sloppy, and none of this would have happened if Tyrannus' son had got a doctor rather than a priest to treat his injuries. It is all consequential. It took about 2 weeks to write up the first draft of all 3 episodes. After that, I gave it some breathing space and reread it after about 2 months. Then I rewrote it for a second draft. I was satisfied for the most part, so I decided to go ahead with production. Production. I was in between projects waiting for the sound mix for my short film Goodnight Midnight to be finished before I began editing my other short film Trespass. I wanted to be productive, so I decided to make Death to Dorkau. In a similar vein to how I made the Witch Chronicles episodes, I recorded all the dialogue in my flat and I did all the voices myself. Each episode took about 2 or so days to record, each depending on the complexity. You would have voiceover sessions averaging 2 to 3 hours. I'd record each line at least 3 times. I had to be careful with the volume of the voice because I didn't want audio to be distorted as my microphone was acting up. I used a cheap USB microphone for this project. It's the same one I used for the Witch Chronicles episodes. It's not perfect, it emits a certain hiss noise that I don't like. I have better mics, but they are all lavaliers or shotgun mics, and I would use them for film recording, which is very different from what I'm doing here. Also, the USB mic recorded directly into the computer, which is very handy. I recorded the files in 32-bit 48 kHz sample rate. It would be good quality if I had a better mic, but we work with what we have. The main thing about performances myself was making sure that each character sounded different, both in cadence and accent. Milos talks like a very hesitant, soft intellectual. Alligar sounds like a more brutish rogue. Tyrannus talks like a cold, calculating leader. Not necessarily a guy you would see on the front lines, he's almost snake-like, if that makes sense. Rylock needed a certain charm, but he also wanted to exhibit his temperament as well. Accents, for the most part, I was aiming for a mix between Russian and Eastern European. I'm sure listeners from that region would find my attempt at the accents appalling, but I did my best. The main thing is maintaining the accent alongside the performance, because you want to avoid slipping when you're going for something. However, you don't want to focus too much about that stuff because it will ultimately diminish the performance. Like, say you were playing a character who was stuck in a house during an earthquake. You want to portray that fear alongside getting the lines right, but you don't want to be thinking about how to pronounce the letter R in an American accent. There's too much going on. I think I was happy for the most part with the performances as a whole. I'm not striving for 100%, rather I'm looking for 80%. It's more time efficient, you get more done, you're learning more, less self-doubt, and you begin to think about problems. But more importantly, you're thinking about the solution to those problems. As a matter of fact, I did something I usually never do for production. I started doing some rewrites. So, say for instance, as soon as I finished making episode 1, I reread episode 2 and decided I would rewrite some of it. Namely, I decided to make Alligar a traitor. In the first 2 drafts, he became an informant after he was tortured by the regime. However, this time around, I thought it would be more interesting if he decided to betray Milos from the get-go. With the inclusion of the scene where Alligar and Milos talk about the fake Dominion blade Milos bought, it didn't make sense for Alligar not to mention that the Masor blade was also fake, especially since he claimed he knows a fake blade when he sees one. This in turn created a more dramatic concept where Alligar knows that the conspiracy is doomed to fail, and therefore he decides to betray them to better his own standing. However, he needs to cover up his own involvement in the conspiracy, and it's better for his standing if he hunted them down after they attempted the coup rather than preventing it from happening in the first place. Hence why Alligar was in the castle. He snuck in just so Milos would definitely have a chance to get to Dorkau's heart. That in turn led for Milos to have some paranoid thoughts about what Alligar was doing there, suspecting subterfuge in the conspiracy. In the end, I made the whole story more interesting. I wouldn't recommend this process for film just because it could get messy very quickly, especially since actors have to learn the lines for film, whereas with voice recording sessions, they would just be reading off of a page. Actually, the hardest part of the whole performance is trying to say the lines like you're not just reading off of a page, but you are actually saying this to a person. The good thing about having myself do all the voices is I have the advantage of knowing the energy the other characters are giving off, so I can say the lines knowing how to respond to that energy. When directing actors in the booth, you have to be careful about making sure the tone of their voice is fitting just right. They're often recording separately, so when you edit them all together, you want to make it sound like they're all in the same room talking to each other. You don't want one person talking very quietly and the other person shouting for no reason, because the tone of voice doesn't make sense. In acting, it's important to listen because that not only dictates what you're about to say, but how you say it. In the end, production took a few days. The vast majority of time was spent on the edit, which I will now talk about. Post-production. I edited each episode of Death to Dorkau on Adobe Audition, my sound editing program of choice. I worked on each episode one by one, so as soon as I finished recording episode 1, I edited episode 1. After I finished editing episode 1, I recorded episode 2, and then I edited episode 2. Same for episode 3. I remember for Orchard, I would edit all 3 episodes like back and forth, which is insane because each episode is like 50 minutes long and way too complex. With Dorkau, the goal was simplicity. Minimal characters, minimal narration, minimal locations. It's very much like a stage play in certain respects. The editing process for Dorkau was a lot easier and had a faster turnaround. I would start out by placing all the files into a multi-track program. Each character gets their own tracks. I would listen to every audio file I recorded. Some files would be up to 45 minutes long. I would cut out the dead space and select what takes I would use. It was a lengthy and monotonous process that isn't fun, but it has to be done. After I have selected what takes to use for each and every character, I then build a rough timeline, placing the narration and dialogue in the same order as the script, basically creating a rough cut for the episode. After I do that, I listen to the rough cut, I then go through the edit and cut out the unnecessary lines, tighten up the pacing, add space where necessary for sound effects and music to take place, stuff like that. I recall for episode 2, the first cut was something like 32 minutes. However, after trimming the edit, getting rid of certain things, I cut it down to something like 26 minutes. There's a lot of reasons you'll need to cut something. If you want to make the project have a shorter runtime, you have to cut some scenes. Runtime wasn't necessarily a concern for me, but I did plan to have each episode average around 30 minutes. My main priority in what stays and what goes is this question: does it serve the story? If it doesn't serve the story in advancing the plot, in developing the character, in maintaining the tone, you cut it. There is a few jokes I cut because it didn't serve the scene. There's a few lines I removed because the information was either repetitive or it was no longer plot relevant. I'll even cut a few words in a sentence just to get a more succinct line or improve a performance. All of that comes into mind when editing. You're constantly asking how to make it better, and when you have a good foundation, the rest will follow suit. After refining the rough cut, I'll start on a sound edit, in which I add sound effects that will be used alongside adjusting the voices of the characters. For characters like Alagar, Rylock, and Dorkau, I had to lower the pitch of their voices as I felt they sounded too similar to my other performances. So adjusting the pitch allowed them to be differentiated easier. I did a similar thing with certain characters and gave them a higher pitch for the same reason. For the narration, including the Beholder narration and Milos' narration, I didn't add any reverb effects or anything like that. I wanted that audio clean. Like it was being heard from a vacuum and therefore we'd know it was voiceover. With other voices, pretty much everything had reverb effects on it. Each location had its own reverb just to establish the kind of space it is. The cellar sounds very echoey but underground. The church and castle sounds very vacuous. Small rooms sound small, large rooms sound large. That kind of thing. You have to be careful with adding effects to the voices because you want to avoid creating things like artifacts, which damage the sound quality of the sound files, making it sound less cool and more fake. It helps to edit the sound on tracks rather than individual files. That way it is less CPU intensive. Therefore, your computer has less issues. Sometimes certain characters would have separate tracks just for their reverb of a certain location. For example, in episode 2, Milos had 4 different tracks. One track for his narration VO, one for his dialogue in the cellar, one for his dialogue in the carriage, and one for his dialogue in the castle. Each track sounds completely different reverb-wise, which is why they need to be separate. I would do similar things for each character and sometimes sound effects as well. Sound effects, I relied on my own library of royalty-free stuff I collected over the years. However, I'd often find myself looking for the usual websites in search of an exact sound that I needed. It's a frustrating process because you're essentially sitting through trash in search of exactly what you need. Oftentimes you can't find exactly what you need, so you either settle or change the sound of a certain part of the scene just to make it work. I think one of the most difficult things for me to edit was the final scene with Dorkau. It's called Deaf to Dorkau. He's mentioned all the time. You have to show him at least once, otherwise, what's the point? With this scene, I went in knowing it had to be quiet, which is very scary for a sound editor because you're relying solely on the performance. You don't have any background sound or music to help with the pacing. I settled with having music and some sounds when Milos is brought into the room as the hood was being taken off of him. That plays into the tone of the scene. The silence after that adds to the gravitas of the character of Dorkau. You just hear his voice, some cutlery as he's eating, then some movement noises as he approaches Milos. After he stabs Milos, you get the music and we return to a more traditional soundscape. But for that first part, you needed that silence. And if this scene doesn't work, the show doesn't work. So it's important you get it right. Everything else was easy in comparison. The priority was dialogue, everything had to be clear and legible. After that, Atmos had to be included. Each environment was different, each room sounded different. Atmos does a great job of establishing tone as well and helps differentiate location from location, so it's easier for a listener to understand what is going on. After that, sound effects play an important role. But it's not just about what you decide to put in, it's also important what you decide not to put in. I strive for simplicity. It's easier to read for an audience, it's easier to feel and to be immersed. So, say if you're in a prison cell, you're gonna hear stuff like prisoners in the distance and a leaky pipe and a draft. You don't need to overcomplicate it with screams or the screeching of metal chains or rats scurrying about. That is too complicated for an audio only medium. You need to keep it simple because you don't want the audience to get distracted. You want them focused on the story, and if it doesn't serve the story, you don't put it in. Most of it is common sense stuff, like you don't put a wooden door in a dungeon. It's a creaky metal door, not a wooden door for a dungeon. You don't put a metal door in a tavern. In a tavern, it will be a wood door. It's that type of thinking. You want stuff that is instantly recognizable. It helps establish the location, the vibe, and the scene as a whole. Sound effects are helpful for scene transitions as well, like often you'll hear a whoosh of some wind during a scene transitions to help differentiate locations. Stuff like doors opening and closing are great too, as it provides a great sound that can serve as an aid to a transition. Sound effects also help with the tone, like one of the big sound effects I use constantly throughout the series was the heartbeat. Each episode begins with a heartbeat. It's a good rhythm to entrance the audience, it's very plot relevant, and it makes an intro all the more interesting. Intros are important. When you're making stuff, you don't want to be boring. You're competing with a billion YouTube videos, a trillion songs, 4 dozen streaming services with countless movies and TV shows. You have to be different. You have to be engaging. If you don't grab someone within the first 5 seconds, you lost them. In the same way, music plays a vital role in the series. Music helps establish the tone, it helps pick up the pacing, the vibe, everything. When I made Orchard, I was going in knowing this would be a very conventional Witcher type vibe, a very Eurocentric sound with orchestras and strings, that type of thing. With Deaf to Dorkau, I wanted it to be more like Dune, just completely alien to what we had seen in this world. So I went more in like the Middle Eastern music, flutes. We had strings as well, but they were very sparing. It has a completely different vibe to Orchard, which is what I wanted. I am very fussy with music. If it doesn't sound right, it doesn't go in. Then of course you'll find a song that sounds perfect, but there's an annoying part you have to get rid of, so you edit that out. Or you have a song that suits perfect, but it only works at the end of the scene, so you have to edit it down or sometimes extend it. Music can also serve great as scene transitions as well, which you'll see a lot. They are used for certain characters, like for instance, the song that plays during Alagar and Milos' first meeting is used again during their last meeting. Inclusion of music is important, but the exclusion of music is equally important. There's big chunks of this episode where there is no score. This allows for the audience to focus on the dialogue that is being said. For most of the cellar scenes with the conspirators, there's little to no music. A similar thing with the Dorkau scene. Like sound effects, music is there to elevate, not diminish. You don't want to use it as a crutch. If you have a good foundation, music will only make a good thing even better. In the end, each episode took about a week to edit, 3 weeks total, not including the writing and recording process. After each episode was complete, I listened to it again and again, tidying it up, adjusting levels for both dialogue and other signs, ensuring it was all clear and crisp. It can be monotonous work, but what I feel helps is being objective. Listening and writing up a list of what needs fixed, what needs to be added, and what needs to be removed. It gives you clear defined goals which you can scratch off one by one. It makes the creative project a lot more manageable for me personally. After many revisions, we reach a point where I am satisfied with the work. I export, I upload it, and share it with people online. Conclusion. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the project. It's not perfect. Some performances could have been better. Pacing is off at times. Audio quality of the microphone I used bugs me, but I couldn't really fix it with the stuff I had. There is some really cool edits here I really like. My favorite parts would be the opening of each episode with the heartbeats. I think that's really great. Then of course we have the farewell scene with Tyrannus and Milos in episode 2, where that ticking noise from the market atmos in the background syncs just perfectly with the music that is about to play for the rest of the sequence. I think the writing is solid for the most part. Dialogue can become a bit clunky and exposition heavy at times, but you can't really do much about it. Otherwise, the audience will have no clue what is going on. Plot is really good for the most part. It may feel rushed at times, but that's mostly because I wanted it all to take place within 3 episodes. I could have drawn it out to 4, but I didn't see the point. After a while, it would just get too complicated, and what I strived for was something simple. Music is good, sound effects are good for the most part, edit is solid for the most part as well. I don't know if it's as good as, say, Orchard, for instance, because that was like an entirely different beast and very complicated in and of itself. However, for what it is, I think Death to Dorkau is really good. What's next? I'm going to finish off my short films Goodnight Midnight and Trespass. I will get around to making The Witch and the Heart of Stone at some point, hopefully this year. That will likely be one big audio episode, like a 19-minute movie rather than a whole series. I think that will be easier in regard to writing. It's a big werewolf story, so it should be fun. I also want to make another short film called God's Country. It's kind of like an Irish version of No Country for Old Men. I'm going to try to get funding sorted for that soon. Hopefully I make that film come autumn time. After that, there's a lot I need to do. In regard to audio, you'll be getting Witch Chronicles episodes monthly, so there will be plenty to listen to in the meantime. All in all, I reckon I will be quite busy. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.